Florence Taylor's throat burned as she swallowed her tears, clutching the letter in her trembling hands while the stagecoach rattled westward through the Kansas Territory in the spring of 1875. The postmark from back east felt like a ghost from another life, a life where her voice hadn't been broken by the scarlet fever that had nearly taken her from this world 2 winters ago. Last stop before Willow Creek, the driver called out, his voice carrying through the open window. Florence tucked the letter into her satchel, the words from her former fiancé still stinging fresh. "I cannot marry a woman whose voice sounds like broken glass on gravel. It would be an embarrassment to us both." The stagecoach lurched to a halt, dust billowing around the wheels. Florence gathered her belongings, her heart pounding against her ribs. Her sister Harriet had written that Willow Creek needed a schoolteacher desperately, and Florence had jumped at the opportunity to escape the whispers and stares that had followed her since her recovery. The driver helped her down, his eyes widening slightly when she thanked him, her voice coming out in that strange, rasping rhythm that had become her curse. He quickly looked away, mumbling something about her luggage. Willow Creek appeared before her, a single dusty street lined with wooden buildings. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the road as Florence made her way toward what her sister had described as the town's only boarding house. Miss Taylor. A woman in her 40s approached, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "I'm Mrs. Winters. Your sister sent word you'd be arriving today. Welcome to Willow Creek." Florence nodded, offering her hand. Thank you for having me," she managed, the words catching and breaking in her damaged throat. Mrs. Winters' eyebrows rose slightly, but to her credit, she didn't comment. "Well now, you must be exhausted. Let me show you to your room. School term starts in 3 days, so you've time to settle in." The boarding house was clean but simple, with a narrow bed and washstand. Florence unpacked her meager belongings, arranging her books on the small shelf by the window. Teaching had been her passion since she was a girl, and while the fever had taken her smooth voice, it hadn't diminished her knowledge or determination. That evening, she ventured downstairs for supper, where Mrs. Winters introduced her to the other boarders, 2 elderly sisters who owned the millinery shop and Mr. Peterson, who worked at the bank. When Florence spoke, the awkward silence that followed her halting, raspy introduction was painfully familiar. "Well," said one of the sisters, exchanging glances with her sibling, "that's quite an unusual voice you have there." "Scarlet fever," Florence explained simply, forcing herself to meet their curious stares. "How will you manage teaching with such a difficulty?" Mr. Peterson asked bluntly. Florence straightened her shoulders. "Children are more adaptable than most give them credit for," she replied, each word carefully formed. The next morning, Florence decided to familiarize herself with the town. Willow Creek was larger than it first appeared, with a church, general store, livery, and a saloon that seemed busy even in the early hours. As she passed the smithy, the sound of hammering drew her attention. Inside the open doors, a tall man was bent over an anvil, bringing his hammer down with precise strikes on a glowing piece of metal. Sweat glistened on his forearms as he worked, unaware of her presence. When he plunged the metal into a water barrel, steam hissed upward, momentarily obscuring his face. Florence was about to continue on when a small boy darted from behind a stack of lumber, nearly colliding with her. "Careful there," she called out instinctively, her voice breaking and rasping. The boy froze, staring up at her with wide eyes. "You talk funny," he declared loudly. Heat flooded her cheeks as the blacksmith looked up, noticing her for the first time. "Timothy," he said sharply, setting down his hammer, "that's no way to speak to a lady." The boy ducked his head. "Sorry, madam," he mumbled before scurrying away. The blacksmith approached, wiping his hands on a rag. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with dark hair and eyes the color of a summer storm. "I apologize for my nephew," he said. "He means no harm." "It is fine," Florence replied carefully, her voice betraying her as it always did, fracturing mid-sentence. Something flickered across the man's face, not the usual discomfort or pity, but something else she couldn't name. "You must be the new schoolteacher," he said. "Miss Taylor, isn't it?" She nodded, surprised he'd heard of her. "Small town," he explained with a slight smile. "News travels fast. I'm Deacon Hayes." "Florence Taylor," she replied, offering her hand before she could reconsider. His palm was calloused but gentle against hers. "Welcome to Willow Creek, Miss Taylor." The way he held her gaze, steady and unfaltering even as she spoke, made something flutter in her chest. For the first time since her illness, someone wasn't staring at her throat or wincing at her broken sounds. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said, retrieving her hand and ignoring the warmth that lingered. As Florence continued exploring the town, she found herself thinking of the blacksmith's steady gaze. It was a welcome change from what she'd grown accustomed to, but she reminded herself that her purpose here was to teach, not to dwell on kind eyes and strong hands. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of town, a simple clapboard building with a bell tower. Inside, the single room contained rows of benches, a large slate board, and a desk that would be hers. Florence ran her fingers along the smooth wood, imagining the children who would soon fill these seats. Her reverie was interrupted by the door swinging open. A woman in an elaborate green dress entered, eyeing Florence with open curiosity. "So you're the new teacher," she said without preamble. "I'm Vivian Moore, chairman of the school board." "Florence Taylor," she replied, bracing herself for the reaction. Vivian's perfectly arched eyebrows shot up at the sound of Florence's voice. "Well," she said after an uncomfortable pause, "that's unexpected." Florence had heard enough variations of this response to recognize the concern beneath the politeness. "The fever affected my vocal cords, but not my mind or my ability to teach," she said firmly. "Of course, but—" Vivian hesitated. "Some of the parents might be concerned about a teacher who, well, sounds as you do. Children can be impressionable." "My voice will not impede my teaching," Florence insisted. "If anything, it will teach them about perseverance and looking beyond superficial differences." Vivian looked unconvinced but nodded stiffly. "We'll see how it goes. Term starts Monday. 23 students, ages 6 to 16. After Vivian left, Florence sank onto her chair, doubt creeping in. Perhaps she had been foolish to think she could escape her situation by coming west. Different town, same prejudices. The weekend passed quickly as Florence prepared lessons and memorized student names from the roster Vivian had provided. By Monday morning, her nerves were stretched thin, but her resolve remained unshaken. She arrived at the schoolhouse early, arranging books and writing a welcome message on the board. As the bell rang, children began filing in, their curious eyes taking in the new teacher. Florence smiled warmly, directing them to their seats. When the last student had entered, she took a deep breath and faced her class. "Good morning," she began, her voice breaking on the words. "I am Miss Taylor, your new teacher." Whispers immediately erupted. A girl in the front row giggled behind her hand, while a boy in the back called out, "What's wrong with your voice, miss?" Florence had anticipated this. "I had scarlet fever 2 years ago," she explained calmly. "It changed my voice, but not what I know or can teach you." More whispers followed, but Florence pressed on, launching into her lesson with determined enthusiasm. By mid-morning, most of the children seemed to have adjusted to her unusual speech, though a few continued to exchange glances or suppress laughter when she spoke. One girl in particular, Eliza Moore, Vivian's daughter, made no effort to hide her disdain, rolling her eyes dramatically whenever Florence called on her. At noon break, Florence stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, fighting back tears of frustration. The morning had been harder than she'd expected, and she wondered if she was truly cut out for this after all. "Tough first day?" a familiar voice asked. Florence turned to find Deacon Hayes approaching, leading a dappled gray horse. "Children are adaptable," she repeated her earlier conviction, though with less certainty. "They are," he agreed, "but they can also be cruel before they learn better." He reached into his pocket and produced an apple. "Thought you might need this more than Merlin here," he said, nodding at the horse. Florence accepted the apple, touched by the simple kindness. "Thank you." "I was passing by earlier," he admitted. "Heard some laughter that didn't sound like it came from a lesson." Florence sighed. "It will take time for them to get used to. This," she gestured at her throat. Deacon studied her for a moment. "For what it's worth, I think your voice has character, unique, like good steel that's been tempered just right." The unexpected compliment caught her off guard. "Most people find it disturbing," she said softly. "Most people don't listen properly," he replied with a shrug. "Anyway, don't let them get to you. The good ones will come around." As he turned to leave, Florence called after him, "Mr. Hayes, why were you passing by the school?" He glanced back, a half-smile on his face. "Maybe I was curious about our new teacher." The afternoon session went marginally better, though Eliza and her friends continued their subtle mockery. By the time Florence dismissed the class, her throat was sore from the effort of projecting her damaged voice all day. She was erasing the board when she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she found a tall, well-dressed man regarding her with open curiosity. "Miss Taylor, I presume." "Jeremiah Moore, Vivian's husband and town mayor." Florence nodded politely, already wary from her encounter with his wife. "My daughter mentioned your vocal situation," he said, his gaze fixed uncomfortably on her throat. "I must admit, we're concerned about the impression it makes." Florence felt her patience wearing thin. "Mr. Moore, I understand your concerns, but I assure you my voice does not affect my teaching abilities." "Perhaps not, but appearances, or in this case, sounds matter greatly. We've worked hard to make Willow Creek respectable." He cleared his throat. "Perhaps a writing-based curriculum might be better. Minimize the need for you to speak." The suggestion stung more than outright rejection might have. "Children learn through dialogue and discussion, Mr. Moore. I will not compromise their education because my voice makes adults uncomfortable." His expression hardened. "We'll give it a month, Miss Taylor. If things improve, wonderful. If not." He left the threat unspoken. The following days fell into a pattern. Each morning, Florence faced a classroom of children whose reactions ranged from genuine interest to barely concealed ridicule. Eliza Moore and her friends had taken to mimicking Florence's broken speech when they thought she wasn't looking, encouraging others to join in. By Friday, Florence was emotionally exhausted. As she locked the schoolhouse and turned to leave, she found Deacon waiting, leaning against a hitching post. "Thought you might like to see something besides the inside of that schoolhouse," he said, "if you're not too tired." Florence hesitated, but the thought of returning to her solitary room at the boarding house held little appeal. "What did you have in mind?" "There's a spot by the creek I thought you might enjoy. Good place to clear your head after a long week." They walked in comfortable silence, leaving the town behind. The early May air was sweet with wildflowers, and Florence felt some of her tension ebbing away with each step. The creek was wider than she'd expected, its waters clear and swift. Deacon led her to a grassy bank beneath a large cottonwood tree where the view opened up to rolling hills beyond. "It's beautiful," Florence said, the words coming out in her uneven cadence. Deacon nodded, settling beside her on the grass. "Found this place my first week in Willow Creek. Come here when the noise in town gets too much. How long have you been here?" 3 years. Came west after the war with my brother. He passed last winter, leaving me with Timothy. His voice held a quiet grief. "The boy's mother died years ago." "I'm sorry," Florence said softly. "He seems like a good child." "He is, just needs guidance." Deacon glanced at her. "Your first week of teaching, how's it really been?" Florence looked away, unwilling to admit how close she was to giving up. "Challenging," she admitted finally. "The children or the adults?" "Both," she sighed. "Mayor Moore has given me a month to improve the situation." Deacon's expression darkened. "Jeremiah Moore cares more about appearances than substance, always has." They sat quietly for a moment, watching the water flow past. "Can I ask what happened?" Deacon ventured. "With your voice." No one had asked directly before, they'd always talked around it as if it were too terrible to name. The directness of his question was refreshing. Scarlet fever, she explained. 2 years ago, the doctors said I was fortunate many die, but the infection damaged my vocal cords. She paused, running her fingers through the grass. My fiancé broke our engagement after, said he couldn't bear to listen to me for the rest of his life. Anger flashed across Deacon's features. Sounds like you're better off without him. Florence managed a small smile. That's what my sister said. Smart woman, your sister. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the creek, Deacon walked Florence back to town. At the boarding house steps, he paused. Would you consider joining me for Sunday dinner tomorrow? Timothy's been asking about you, and Mrs. Miller makes a roast worth suffering through church for. The invitation caught her by surprise. I would like that, she found herself saying. Sunday morning found Florence in the town's small church, seated beside Mrs. Winters. She noticed Deacon and Timothy several pews ahead, the boy fidgeting as the reverend delivered his sermon. When the congregation rose to sing hymns, Florence remained silent, unwilling to draw attention with her broken voice. After the service, several parents approached her, making polite but distant conversation. Florence could see the uncertainty in their eyes when she replied, the subtle way they shifted when her voice caught on certain words. Deacon appeared at her side, Timothy in tow. Ready for that dinner, Miss Taylor? Mrs. Miller's house was a short walk from the church, a cozy cottage with flowers blooming in window boxes. Inside, the aroma of roast beef and fresh bread filled the air. The elderly woman welcomed Florence warmly, showing no reaction to her voice beyond a kind smile. Deacon tells me you're doing wonders with those children already, Mrs. Miller said as they sat down to eat. About time they had a teacher with some backbone. Timothy peppered Florence with questions throughout the meal. What was it like back east? Did she know how to ride a horse? Had she ever seen an Indian? Florence answered each one patiently, noticing how the boy never flinched at her broken speech. After dinner, Mrs. Miller shooed Deacon and Florence onto the porch while she and Timothy cleared the dishes. She's been like a grandmother to Timothy since we lost James, Deacon explained, leaning against the railing. Takes him every Sunday so I can have a few hours to myself. Not that I mind having him around, but everyone needs moments of quiet, Florence finished for him. Deacon studied her for a moment. You know, the first time I heard your voice, it reminded me of something. Florence braced herself for another well-intentioned but painful comparison. My name, he said simply. The way you say Deacon, it's like you give each part of it special attention. No one's ever said it quite like that before. The unexpected observation left her speechless for a moment. Is that good? He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. It's perfect. The following week at school brought new challenges. Word had spread about Florence spending Sunday with Deacon, and Eliza Moore seemed determined to make her pay for it. My mother says it's inappropriate for the teacher to be courting, she announced loudly during arithmetic. Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks. That is quite enough, Eliza. Return to your sums. She also says your voice is frightening the younger children and you shouldn't be allowed to teach. The classroom fell silent as Florence set down her chalk. 5 minutes of silent reflection, everyone. Eliza, please see me at my desk. When the girl approached, sullen and defiant, Florence spoke quietly so only she could hear. I understand this is difficult for you. Having a new teacher is always an adjustment. Your voice is broken, Eliza said bluntly. It sounds awful. Florence took a deep breath. Yes, my voice is damaged. Just like some people have scars or walk with a limp after an injury, it's different, but it doesn't make me less of a teacher or less of a person. Eliza looked away, but Florence could see the conflict in her expression. I know you're smart, Eliza. Too smart to judge someone based on something so superficial. The girl returned to her seat without further comment, but Florence noticed she didn't join in when her friends mimicked the teacher's speech later that day. As the weeks passed, most of the children adjusted to Florence's unique way of speaking. A few even seemed to have developed a protective attitude toward her, hushing others who made comments. Florence found herself looking forward to her encounters with Deacon, which grew more frequent as May turned to June. He would appear outside the schoolhouse, ostensibly bringing Timothy home but lingering to walk her back to town. Sometimes they would detour to their spot by the creek, talking until the fireflies emerged. Florence learned about his time in the war, his dreams of expanding his blacksmith shop, and his worries about raising Timothy right. In turn, she told him about her life before the fever, her love of teaching, her family back east, and her hopes of someday writing a book of her own. "You should do it," Deacon encouraged her one evening as they sat watching the sunset. "Your voice on paper would be just as distinctive, but in a way everyone could appreciate." "Perhaps," she mused. "First, I need to convince Jeremiah more I'm fit to continue teaching." The end of her probationary month was approaching, and despite the progress with the children, Florence had heard rumors that the school board led by Vivian Moore was divided on whether to keep her on. 2 days before the board was set to vote, disaster struck. Florence was leading the older students through a geography lesson when Eliza's hand shot up. "Miss Taylor, Jimmy's choking." Florence spun around to see a 7-year-old boy red-faced and clutching his throat, unable to breathe. Without hesitation, she rushed to him, turned him around, and performed the maneuver a doctor had once shown her. After several attempts, a marble shot from Jimmy's mouth and he gulped air greedily. "Everyone stay calm," Florence instructed, her broken voice carrying surprising authority. "Eliza, run for the doctor. The rest of you, continue your reading silently." By the time Dr. Wilson arrived, Jimmy was breathing normally, though shaken. As the doctor examined the boy, the door burst open again and several parents rushed in, including Vivian Moore. "What happened?" Vivian demanded, taking in the scene with wide eyes. Dr. Wilson straightened up. "Whatever Miss Taylor did saved this boy's life. Another minute and he might have been beyond help." All eyes turned to Florence, who stood beside Jimmy, her hand on his shoulder. "I just did what needed doing," she said simply, her voice breaking on the words. Jimmy looked up at her with newfound admiration. "Miss Taylor saved me," he announced, "and her voice isn't scary at all, it's brave." The next morning, Florence arrived at school to find a small crowd gathered outside. Mayor Moore stood on the steps, looking uncomfortable as Deacon Hayes faced him, arms crossed. "What's happening here?" Florence asked as she approached. "Just making sure the mayor understands what a valuable teacher we have," Deacon said, his eyes never leaving Moore's face. "Seems saving a child's life should count for something in his decision." Several parents murmured agreement. Florence noticed Mrs. Peterson, Jimmy's mother, standing nearby with gratitude written plainly across her face. "No decision has been made yet," Mayor Moore said stiffly. "The board votes tomorrow." "Then perhaps you should listen to what the parents want," Deacon suggested, gesturing to the gathered crowd. Mayor Moore looked around, clearly assessing the situation. "I will. Take these opinions under advisement," he said finally before walking away. As the crowd dispersed, Florence turned to Deacon. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he replied simply. "This town needs you, Florence. These children need you." He paused, something vulnerable crossing his features. "And I need you." Before she could respond, he continued, "I know it's only been 2 months, but I can't imagine Willow Creek without you now. Can't imagine my life without hearing you say my name in that way. Only you can." Florence's heart pounded against her ribs. "Deacon," she said softly, the syllables breaking and reforming in her damaged voice. "See, just like that," he smiled, taking her hand. "It speaks my name perfectly." The school board voted unanimously to keep Florence on as teacher, a decision announced at a town gathering that evening. As Florence accepted congratulations from parents and students alike, she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since before her illness. Later, walking back to the boarding house with Deacon, she asked the question that had been on her mind all day. "Did you mean what you said?" "About needing me," he stopped, turning to face her in the moonlight. "Every word. I know it might seem fast, but out here, life doesn't always give you the luxury of time. He took both her hands in his. I love your voice, Florence. I love the way it breaks and mends and carries on regardless. But more than that, I love the woman behind it, your courage, your kindness, your determination. Florence felt tears welling in her eyes. Most men would be embarrassed to be with someone who sounds like me. I'm not most men, Deacon said simply. And I could never be embarrassed by someone I'm proud to stand beside. He reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. I'm not asking for promises yet, just a chance to show you what we could build together. I would like that, Florence whispered, her broken voice soft but sure. Over the summer months, their courtship blossomed. Florence continued teaching, her unique voice becoming as much a part of Willow Creek as the church bell or the creek's gentle murmur. Even Eliza Moore eventually came around, staying after school one day to ask for help with an essay and shyly admitting that she'd grown to like the way Miss Taylor explained things. By harvest time, Florence had moved into a small house near the school, which she often shared with Timothy when Deacon needed to work late at the smithy. The boy had taken to calling her Flo with such innocent affection that she couldn't bring herself to correct him. On a crisp October evening, Deacon took Florence back to their spot by the creek, now ablaze with autumn colors. As the sun set, painting the water gold, he knelt before her. Florence Taylor, your voice first caught my attention, but your heart is what kept it. Will you marry me? Will you help me raise Timothy, build a life here, and let me hear you say my name every day for the rest of our lives? Yes, she replied, the word breaking and beautiful. Yes, Deacon Hayes. They were married on Christmas Eve in the town church, with Timothy standing proudly beside them and what seemed like all of Willow Creek in attendance. When it came time for Florence to recite her vows, her voice broke and wavered as it always did, but she spoke clearly and without shame, each fractured word carrying its own kind of music. I do not have a perfect voice, she said, but I promise to speak with perfect love and honesty all the days of our lives. Deacon squeezed her hands, his eyes bright with emotion. Your voice is perfect to me, he replied. It always has been. 5 years later, Florence sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching Deacon teach Timothy and their 3-year-old daughter Rose to shoe a pony. The school had grown to require 2 teachers now, with Florence serving as headmistress. Her book about teaching children with differences had been published the year before, and she'd received letters from educators across the country. Mama, Rose called, breaking away from the men to run toward her. Listen to my hoarse voice. The little girl made neighing sounds, completely unself-conscious. Florence laughed, her broken voice carrying across the yard. Deacon looked up at the sound, a smile spreading across his face, the same smile he'd given her that first day when he'd told her that her voice spoke his name perfectly. I love you, she called to him, the words fracturing and reforming in the air between them. I love you too, he called back, every broken, beautiful sound.